In Australia, we rely on a myth. It's a beautiful myth, the idea that when a disaster strikes, an army of neighbours will rise up, jump on a truck, and protect us all for free. For over a century, that myth held true. But the numbers say that that myth is collapsing. We're facing a polycrisis. Our climate is generating fires and floods of unprecedented intensity. We've got more cars and trucks on the road, and consequently, more accidents. The workforce that we rely on to fight those fires and treat that trauma is shrinking and ageing. And according to Volunteering Australia, since 2015, in the fire service at least, we've lost over 20,000 operational volunteers nationwide. That's a massive collapse in our frontline defence. And it's not just about bodies on trucks, it's about brains in command. You know, it takes about 10 years to train a level 3 incident controller. That's the person who decides if your town evacuates or stays. The veterans holding that knowledge are retiring. And because we aren't recruiting young people now, in 5 years, we won't just be short on manpower. We will be structurally incompetent. We're walking into a firestorm with a rookie workforce, a small rookie workforce. But here's the uncomfortable question. Politicians are already debating behind closed doors. Why is it that when a citizen puts on an Army Reserve uniform to fill sandbags, they're paid as a Tier 1 paid volunteer, receiving tax-free pay and housing subsidies? But when a neighbour puts on a volunteer emergency services uniform to fill the exact same sandbag, well, they're a Tier 4 unpaid volunteer who receives $0 and zero superannuation. Let's look at the structural inequity of volunteering for Australia's emergency services. Now, I'm going to argue why tax incentives or fair compensation might actually be the only way to keep our communities safe. First, the hierarchy of civic duty in Australia. Now, right at the top, we have the Australian Defence Force Reserves. And if you're a reservist private, you earn around $215 a day. If you're an officer, that can go up to nearly $600 a day. And crucially, that money is tax-free. So $200 in the hand is actually worth about $300 of normal taxable salary. Reservists also get health allowances, and after 4 years, access to the Defence Home Ownership Assistance Scheme, a direct monthly subsidy paid into their home mortgage. That's awesome. Now, let's look at the rural fire emergency services, the Bush Fire Service in WA, the CFA in Victoria, or the RFS in New South Wales. Daily pay? Zero. Housing subsidy? Zero. It defies belief. The State of Volunteering Report, South Australia 2023, estimated the financial cost of volunteers themselves at $2.6 billion a year out of their own pockets for fuel, equipment, and lost time just to serve the state. We even pay jurors an attendance allowance. We pay government board members daily sitting fees. But the person putting their life at risk, rushing towards a massive fire to attempt to control it before it burns our houses down, they get nothing. Now, to truly understand how broken this system is, I want you to imagine a self-employed carpenter. Let's call him Jack. Now, Jack runs his own small business. In scenario A, Jack joins the Army Reserve. He gets deployed on a 2-week training exercise. Now, first he gets his daily reserve pay. Let's say he's just a private, $215 a day, and that's tax-free. But here's the killer fact that I think most Australians don't know. The Defence Force has something called the Employer Support Payment Scheme. It pays an employer almost $2,000 a week to cover the cost of losing their staff member. But because Jack is self-employed, he counts as his own employer. And that means that Jack can legally claim that nearly $2,000 a week for himself, on top of his tax-free daily pay. He isn't losing money to serve his country. The system is designed to ensure that his business survives while he serves. That's a brilliant retention model. Now, scenario B. Jack joins the bushfire service. He gets deployed to a massive fire up in the Perth Hills. For 2 weeks, daily pay, zero. Employer support payment for his business, zero. In fact, because Jack isn't working, his business is bleeding money every hour he holds that hose. He's paying for his own fuel to get to the station, and unless it's declared a national disaster spanning over 10 days, and he's fortunate enough to be in New South Wales, he gets nothing. Now, look, I'm not having a go at reservists. They deserve every cent of that tax-free pay and every dollar of that support. The Army model is a success story. It recognises that you can't ask people to defend the nation if it bankrupts them. The problem isn't that the Army gets too much. It's that emergency services get nothing. This is about equity and trying to attract new volunteers whilst keeping some experience in the services and not overworking the long-serving vollies into an early grave. Why is it that the defence of our borders is considered a professional service worthy of financial support, while the defence of our actual homes is treated as a hobby that should cost you money? Now, if you're watching this and you're on the East Coast, you might think that this is just about fire and floods. But if you live in Western Australia, this debate is literally a matter of life and death. And it also involves ambulances. Now, WA is unique. While other states have state-run ambulance services with many paid paramedics, WA relies on St John Ambulance, a non-profit organisation. And in Perth, the paramedics, ambulance drivers, ambulance operators, they're paid. But cross the city limits into the regions, and the 000 response relies on the country ambulance service, still St John's. That one is staffed by over 3,000 volunteers. Think about that. In regional WA, volunteers are covering an area of 2.5 million square kilometres. These people aren't holding a hose, they're managing serious trauma, cardiac arrests. And here's the ethical conflict. When you call an ambulance in rural locations, St John's Ambulance charges you a fee. It generates revenue exceeding $500 million a year. But the person driving the ambulance and the person saving your life isn't getting a wage. Yet, the people at the top certainly are. The board directors of St John WA are paid under a formal director remuneration framework. Their fees are benchmarked against the corporate sector, specifically against industries like health, technology and logistics. And the justification for that? Well, they argue that running a massive semi-corporate entity carries significant legal liability and requires high-level professional governance. True? They treat themselves as corporate professionals. Meanwhile, the 3,000 volunteers actually doing the work are treated as charitable servants. Now, to see how twisted this logic is, compare St John's to another major WA charity, MSWA, formerly the MS Society of Western Australia. MSWA brings in over $100 million a year. They provide complex care for vulnerable people with all sorts of brain injuries and so on. Their board of directors, unpaid volunteers. Their staff, fully paid professionals. MSWA raises money to pay experts to do the work. St John charges money and asks volunteers to do the work for free. St John's argues the paperwork is too complex for a volunteer board. Yet they claim the life and death trauma work is simple enough for a volunteer workforce. That's, for mine, a complete contradiction. It's a two-speed economy within the same organisation. Corporate at the top, community run at the bottom. Now, the 2022 parliamentary inquiry into ambulance services specifically highlighted this culture gap between the polished paid head office and the burnt out volunteers on the ground. The business model effectively relies on the goodwill of country people to subsidise a critical state service. If St John was a cafe and they asked the staff to make coffee for free whilst charging customers $5 a cup to pay the board, we'd call it wage theft. In the bush, we call it community spirit. This workforce is burning out. They are doing highly skilled, fast response medical for free, often on 24/7 rosters. You may have heard the high rotation ads on the radio. Recruitment campaigns are struggling to find people willing to take on that level of responsibility for nada. It is the most extreme example of the state outsourcing its essential duty of care to unpaid goodwill. So, what's the solution? We have a missing middle in our workforce. The average volunteer age in places like Queensland is 54. Youth participation has crashed from 36% to 25% in just 3 years. And it's not because young people are lazy. They are precariously employed. 30 years ago, the local boss let you run out the door when the siren went off. Today, your boss is an app, AI, or a corporate HR department in Sydney. They don't care about the fire, they care about the timesheet. The economy has changed, but the volunteer model is stuck in 1950. Many volunteer chiefs actually oppose the idea of a direct hourly wage for volunteers because they worry it will destroy the mateship culture. I guess this altruism, it'll bring in unions and possibly more red tape, but we don't need a wage. What we need is a supported volunteer model. So here's some ideas. Proposal 1, a federal tax offset. Now, a Senate inquiry has already looked at this. Imagine a system where if you serve active duty, that is attending training or incidents, or actually just being directly involved in the provision of the emergency service, then you get a $5,000 direct tax credit at the end of the year. That acknowledges the cost that you've incurred without making you an employee. Proposal 2, HECS and HELP debt relief. If we want young people, offer to wipe 20% of their student loan debt for every 3 years of active service with volunteer emergency services. Now, the United States does this with their National Guard, and it is their single most effective recruiting tool for young people. Good work. Proposal 3, housing support. Why shouldn't a long-serving volunteer get access to the Defence Home Ownership Assistance Scheme? If they protect the community for 10 years, help them buy a house in that community. It keeps them there as well. It keeps them in the country. The era of the free emergency service is over. We just haven't admitted it yet. We pay our reservists because we value national defence. We pay our jurors because we value justice. When a cyclone hits the Pilbara or fires sweep through the Blue Mountains, we expect Jack the carpenter to close his business, lose his income, and risk his life for free. Now, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The Army Reserve has already shown us the blueprint. Tax-free incentives, housing support, and employer compensation. If we can do it for the soldier who fills sandbags abroad, we can do it for the volunteer who fills sandbags at home.